Michael, there's something about Sarah you need to know before you say I do tomorrow, Margaret whispered, her weathered hands trembling as she clutched a manila envelope against her chest. The wedding rehearsal had ended just an hour ago, and the Peterson family home in Riverside, California, buzzed with the quiet energy of anticipation. Fairy lights still twinkled in the backyard where tomorrow's ceremony would take place, but inside the kitchen, those words hung in the air like a storm cloud threatening to destroy everything. The envelope made a soft, crinkling sound as Margaret's grip tightened, and Michael could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The scent of his grandmother's apple pie cooling on the counter suddenly felt overwhelming, mixing with the lavender his mother always wore. Something in her voice, something broken and desperate, made his stomach drop like he was falling from a great height. Michael David Peterson had always trusted his mother's judgment completely, but standing there in the warm glow of the kitchen, where he'd eaten countless childhood breakfasts, he felt the foundation of his world beginning to crack. At 28, he was the kind of man people described as steady, a software engineer who paid his bills on time, called his parents every Sunday, and had been planning this wedding for 18 months with the methodical precision that made him so good at his job. His sandy brown hair was still perfectly styled from the rehearsal, his button-down shirt crisp despite the long day, but his blue eyes now reflected a confusion that seemed to age him years in seconds. The diamond engagement ring he'd saved for 2 years to buy suddenly felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket, even though Sarah was wearing it proudly just rooms away. Tomorrow was supposed to be the happiest day of his life, the culmination of 3 years with the woman who had become his everything. Have you ever felt that moment when your whole world shifts on its axis? When someone you love is about to tell you something that you know will change everything forever? Share in the comments where you're watching from, and let me know if you've ever faced a moment like this. Margaret Elizabeth Peterson had raised 4 children and buried a husband, and in her 63 years on this earth, she had learned to recognize the weight of secrets that demanded to be told. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for decades, and her green eyes, the same ones Michael had inherited, were red-rimmed with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. She wore her best navy dress, the one she'd chosen specially for tomorrow's mother-of-the-groom duties, but now it felt like armor she was wearing into battle. The envelope in her hands contained photocopies of documents, newspaper clippings, and a letter written in handwriting she recognized but wished she didn't. Margaret had spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling of her bedroom, wrestling with whether this information was hers to share. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 times, marking another day closer to what she feared might be a terrible mistake. Sarah Michelle Coleman had walked into Michael's life like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, or so everyone had said at the time. She was 26 with auburn hair that caught the light like spun copper, and a smile that could light up any room she entered. Her laugh was infectious, the kind that made strangers turn to look and smile along with her, and she had a way of making Michael feel like he was the only person in the world when she looked at him. They'd met at a coffee shop near his office. She was reading a vintage paperback novel while sipping a lavender latte, and he'd worked up the courage to ask about the book. What followed was 3 hours of conversation that felt like 3 minutes, and a courtship that everyone described as a fairy tale romance. Sarah worked as a freelance graphic designer, traveled frequently for work, and had a bohemian spirit that perfectly complemented Michael's structured life. She made him laugh, pushed him to try new things, and loved him with a passion that sometimes took his breath away. But standing in that kitchen, looking at his mother's tear-streaked face and the envelope that seemed to pulse with dangerous secrets, Michael felt the first tendrils of doubt creeping into his heart like poison ivy. Sarah was upstairs in his childhood bedroom, probably already asleep after the long day of final preparations. Her wedding dress hung in the closet like a ghost, pristine white silk and lace that had cost more than his first car. The guest list included 230 people. The catering was confirmed, the flowers had been delivered that morning, and the string quartet was scheduled to arrive at noon. Cancelling now would be a disaster of epic proportions, not to mention the financial ruin it would bring. But Margaret's expression suggested that going through with the wedding might be an even bigger disaster. The weight of the moment pressed down on Michael's shoulders like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe in the suddenly stifling kitchen. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Michael finally managed to whisper, his voice cracking like a teenager's. He reached for one of the kitchen chairs and sank into it. the same chair where he'd sat for homework help and heart-to-heart talks throughout his childhood. The familiar comfort of that seat now felt foreign and strange, as if he was seeing his entire life through new eyes. Margaret moved closer, her sensible shoes making soft sounds against the linoleum floor that had seen decades of family gatherings, birthday parties, and quiet conversations just like this one. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, covered with photos from the engagement party, save-the-date magnets and a grocery list written in Sarah's flowing handwriting. Everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, but Michael could feel that something fundamental had already shifted, like the moment before an earthquake, when animals sense the danger before humans do. The manila envelope seemed to grow heavier in Margaret's hands as she pulled out a chair across from her son. The kitchen table, made of solid oak by Michael's grandfather 30 years ago, had witnessed countless family dramas, but none quite like this. Margaret's wedding ring caught the light as she placed the envelope on the table between them, and for a moment, the only sound was the tick of the clock and the distant hum of traffic on the nearby highway. Michael stared at that envelope like it might contain a bomb, which in many ways it did. His mother had always been the rock of their family, the one who held everyone together after his father's death from cancer 5 years ago. She wasn't prone to dramatics or last-minute revelations, which made this moment even more terrifying. If Margaret Peterson felt compelled to share a secret the night before his wedding, it had to be something that would fundamentally change everything he thought he knew about his life. "I hired a private investigator," Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit Michael like a physical blow, and he felt the air leave his lungs in a rush. His mother, the woman who had taught him about trust and honesty, had been secretly investigating the woman he planned to marry. The betrayal felt almost as sharp as whatever revelation was coming next. Margaret's hands shook as she opened the envelope, revealing a stack of papers that looked official and somehow ominous in the soft kitchen lighting. The smell of the cooling apple pie now seemed sickly sweet, and Michael pushed back from the table slightly, instinctively creating distance from whatever bomb was about to explode his carefully constructed world. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, and the sound seemed to come from another universe entirely, a place where people weren't having life-altering conversations on the eve of what should be the happiest day of their lives. The private investigator's report was thorough, Margaret explained, spreading several documents across the table like tarot cards predicting a dark future. There were photographs, copies of legal documents, and what appeared to be newspaper clippings from various cities across the country. Michael's engineering mind tried to process what he was seeing, but the pieces felt like they belonged to a jigsaw puzzle of someone else's life. Sarah's face smiled up at him from several photos, but in context that made no sense with the story she'd told him about her past. In some pictures, her hair was different colors, and in others, she was standing next to men Michael had never heard mentioned. The documents bore different versions of her name: Sarah Coleman, Sarah Mitchell, Michelle Sarah Banks, and addresses in cities she'd never mentioned visiting, let alone living in. The evidence spread before him suggested a life far more complicated and possibly dangerous than the free-spirited artist narrative she'd always shared. "How long have you known?" Michael asked, his voice hollow and strange to his own ears. Margaret looked older than he'd ever seen her, the weight of keeping this secret clearly having taken a toll on her usually resilient spirit. She explained that her suspicions had begun small. Little inconsistencies in Sarah's stories, phone calls she would take in private, the way she always paid for things in cash, and seemed nervous around official documents. At first, Margaret had chalked it up to her own overprotectiveness, the natural suspicion of a mother who didn't want to see her son hurt. But when Sarah had been evasive about guest lists and seemed panicked about having too many photos taken at the wedding, Margaret's concerns had grown into full-blown worry. The investigation had taken 3 months, and every week had brought new revelations that painted a picture of a woman living multiple lives across multiple states. The most recent information had arrived just yesterday, which explained the timing of this devastating conversation. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too warm, too full of memories that now seemed tainted by this new reality. Michael stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where he could see the backyard wedding setup bathed in moonlight. The white chairs arranged in perfect rows, the arch decorated with flowers that had cost a fortune, the dance floor where he'd imagined holding Sarah for their first dance as husband and wife. Everything looked exactly as he'd dreamed it would, but now it felt like a stage set for a play he no longer wanted to perform in. His reflection in the window showed a man who looked like he'd aged a decade in 10 minutes. And behind that reflection, he could see his mother watching him, with a mixture of love, guilt, and desperate hope that he would understand why she'd had to tell him the truth. The grandfather clock chimed again, marking another quarter hour closer to a wedding day that might never happen. The weight of decision pressed down on Michael's shoulders as he turned back to face his mother, and the evidence spread across their family table. Tomorrow morning, 230 guests would arrive expecting to witness a celebration of love and commitment. Sarah would put on her dream dress, and his groomsmen would adjust their ties and make jokes about married life. The photographer would capture what was supposed to be the beginning of their happily ever after, and the caterers would serve a meal that represented months of tastings and planning. But now, staring at documents that suggested the woman he loved might not be who she claimed to be, Michael felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, forced to choose between jumping into the unknown or stepping back into a life that might be built on lies. The apple pie had stopped steaming. The kitchen had grown quiet except for the persistent tick of time passing, and somewhere upstairs, the woman who had stolen his heart was sleeping peacefully, unaware that her secrets had finally caught up with her on the night before what should have been the most important day of both their lives. "What am I supposed to do with this, Mom?" Michael whispered, sinking back into his chair as the full weight of the situation crashed over him like a tsunami. The envelope and its contents sat between them like a loaded gun, and Margaret reached across the table to take her son's hand with the same gentle touch that had comforted him through skinned knees and broken hearts throughout his childhood. But this wasn't a scraped knee or teenage heartbreak. This was his entire adult life hanging in the balance, and the woman sleeping upstairs held secrets that might destroy everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and the future he'd so carefully planned. The clock continued its relentless march toward tomorrow, and Michael Peterson sat in his childhood kitchen, holding his mother's hand and staring at evidence that the woman he was supposed to marry in less than 14 hours might be a complete stranger after all. Sleep became impossible that night, and Michael found himself pacing the hardwood floors of his childhood bedroom like a caged animal, careful not to wake Sarah, who lay curled beneath his old Star Wars comforter. Her auburn hair spread across the pillow like silk. The digital clock on his nightstand glowed an angry red too. 47 a.m., and every minute that passed felt like an hour stretching toward an inevitable reckoning. The private investigator's documents were hidden in his desk drawer, but they might as well have been branded into his retinas for how clearly he could see every damning detail. Sarah Michelle Coleman, or whoever she really was, breathed softly in the bed they'd shared during her visits home, completely unaware that her carefully constructed world was crumbling in the darkness just feet away. The familiar sounds of the old house settling seemed amplified in the silence. Creaking floorboards that had witnessed his childhood, the whisper of wind through oak trees that had stood sentinel over Peterson family secrets for decades. Michael pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw stars, trying to push away the images from those photographs, but they persisted like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The emptiness in his chest felt like a physical wound, as if someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made him feel whole. 3 years of memories now felt contaminated, every sweet moment now carrying the bitter taste of potential deception. He remembered their first Christmas together, when Sarah had cried opening the antique locket he'd found at a flea market, because it reminded her of one her grandmother had given her as a child. Had those tears been real, or just another performance in whatever elaborate con she was running? The way she'd held him during his father's funeral, whispering words of comfort that had gotten him through the darkest days of his grief. Had her compassion been genuine, or was she simply playing the role of the supportive girlfriend to maintain her cover? Every kiss, every laugh, every whispered, "I love you" in the darkness of their shared apartment now felt like evidence in a case he was building against his own heart. The weight of doubt was crushing him, making it hard to breathe in the room where he'd once felt nothing but safety and love. Michael crept downstairs to the living room, where family photographs chronicled decades of Peterson family history in silver frames that caught moonlight streaming through lace curtains. His parents' wedding portrait sat on the mantel, Margaret radiant in her simple white dress, his father David handsome in his army dress uniform, both of them glowing with the kind of innocent joy that seemed impossible in today's complicated world. They'd been married 42 years before cancer took David, and Margaret had never stopped wearing her wedding ring or speaking about her husband in the present tense, as if love could transcend even death. Michael had wanted that kind of marriage, that unshakable foundation of trust and commitment that could weather any storm life threw at them. He'd thought he'd found it with Sarah, thought he'd discovered in her the same kind of pure love his parents had shared. Now, staring at his parents' young faces, frozen in that moment of perfect happiness, Michael felt like he was mourning not just his relationship, but his faith in love itself. The photograph album Margaret kept on the coffee table fell open to pictures from Michael's college graduation, and there was Sarah in a yellow sundress, beaming as she posed with his family, even though they'd only been dating for 6 months at the time. She'd driven 4 hours to be there, bringing homemade cookies for the celebration dinner, and charming every aunt, uncle and cousin with her easy laugh and genuine interest in their stories. His cousin Tommy had pulled him aside that day and said, "Don't let this one get away, Mike, she's special." Even his usually critical great-aunt Florence had declared Sarah a keeper, after just one conversation about vintage quilting patterns. Michael studied Sarah's face in that photograph, searching for some sign of the deception that now seemed so obvious in hindsight, but all he could see was the woman who had become his best friend, his confidant, his partner in every decision, big and small. The woman who knew he liked his coffee black in the morning, but with cream in the afternoon, who had memorized his work schedule and always called during his lunch break just to hear his voice. The memories came flooding back like a broken dam, Sarah surprising him with tickets to see his favorite band for his birthday, even though she hated their music, but sat through the entire concert with a smile because it made him happy. The way she'd taken care of him when he had the flu last winter, making homemade chicken soup and watching terrible reality TV shows with him for 3 days straight, without complaint. How she'd cried the night he'd proposed, not the pretty tears of a Hallmark movie, but ugly, snotty sobs of someone overwhelmed by genuine emotion. She'd said yes before he'd even finished his carefully rehearsed speech, throwing her arms around his neck with such force that they'd both tumbled backward into the sand on the beach where he'd planned the perfect sunset proposal. The ring had almost been lost in the chaos, but they'd found it together, laughing and kissing as waves crashed around their feet. That moment had felt like the beginning of their real life together, the first page of a love story that was supposed to last forever. But what if it had all been an elaborate performance? The question tormented Michael as he wandered through the house like a ghost, unable to settle anywhere for more than a few minutes. What if Sarah had targeted him specifically, chosen him for reasons that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with whatever scheme the private investigator had uncovered? The thought made him physically ill, and he found himself bent over the kitchen sink, dry heaving as his body rejected the very idea that he might have been nothing more than a mark in some long con. The woman he'd shared his deepest fears with, who knew about his recurring nightmares about losing his job, his anxiety about living up to his father's memory, his secret dream of someday writing a novel. What if she'd simply been collecting information to use against him later? The intimacy they'd shared, both emotional and physical, now felt violated and dirty, as if someone had taken his most precious memories and twisted them into weapons designed to hurt him. The private investigator's report had mentioned other men, other relationships that seemed to follow similar patterns. Sarah would appear in their lives like a blessing, becoming everything they needed her to be, and then disappear when things got too complicated, or when she'd gotten whatever it was she was really after. Michael pulled the documents from his hiding place and spread them across the kitchen table again, studying the timeline of Sarah's life with the methodical attention to detail that made him good at debugging code. There was Sarah Coleman in Denver, engaged to a wealthy contractor who died in a suspicious car accident just weeks before their wedding. Sarah Mitchell in Phoenix, living with a tech entrepreneur who'd lost his life savings to cryptocurrency investments she'd recommended. Michelle Banks in Seattle, married to a restaurant owner whose business had burned down under mysterious circumstances, the insurance payout disappearing along with his wife shortly after. The pattern was there, clear as day once you knew what to look for, but Michael had been too blinded by love to see the signs that now seemed obvious. Each document felt like a punch to the gut, but Michael forced himself to read every word, every police report, every newspaper article about missing persons and unsolved cases. There were no criminal charges. Sarah, or whoever she really was, had been too careful for that, but the circumstantial evidence painted a picture of a woman who used love as a weapon, who specialized in finding lonely, trusting men and exploiting their desire for connection until she'd gotten what she needed from them. The most recent case was in Portland, where she'd been Sarah Williams, living with a software engineer remarkably similar to Michael in both profession and personality. That man, James Chen, had filed a missing persons report when Sarah vanished with his life savings and the proceeds from selling his grandmother's jewelry collection, but the police had found no trace of her after she disappeared. The investigators' notes suggested that James Chen had attempted suicide 6 months after Sarah's disappearance, unable to cope with the betrayal and financial ruin she'd left in her wake. "Is that my future?" Michael whispered to the empty kitchen, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Would he become another cautionary tale, another broken man left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by someone he'd trusted completely? The wedding was in less than 8 hours, and he felt like he was drowning in information that changed everything he thought he knew about the woman sleeping upstairs. Part of him wanted to wake her up and demand explanations, to give her a chance to defend herself against the evidence that seemed so damning in the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen. But a larger part of him was terrified that any confrontation would result in her disappearance, leaving him with nothing but questions and the kind of devastating emptiness that had driven James Chen to attempt to end his own life. The weight of decision pressed down on Michael's shoulders like a physical force, and he found himself wishing desperately that his father was still alive to offer the kind of steady, practical advice that had guided him through every major crisis of his life. The grandfather clock chimed 4 times, marking another hour closer to a wedding that might be the biggest mistake of Michael's life. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky, and soon their house would be buzzing with activity as caterers, florists, and photographers arrived to set up for what everyone expected to be a perfect celebration of love and commitment. Michael thought about the honeymoon they'd planned in Italy, the apartment lease they'd signed together, the joint bank account they'd opened just last month. Every aspect of their shared future now felt like it might be part of an elaborate trap, designed to give Sarah access to his life, his money, and his trust in ways that would leave him vulnerable to the same kind of devastating betrayal that had destroyed the other men in her wake. The beautiful wedding dress hanging in his closet upstairs now looked less like a symbol of hope, and more like a costume for the final act of whatever performance Sarah had been giving for the past 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on him that today actually, was supposed to be about making vows of honesty and faithfulness to someone who might have built their entire relationship on lies. Michael stared at the wedding planning folder Sarah had organized with such care, filled with color-coordinated tabs for every vendor, timeline, and detail of their perfect day. Her handwriting filled the margins with notes about last-minute changes and special touches she'd wanted to include to make their wedding uniquely theirs. The woman who had created this beautiful celebration, who had spent months pouring her heart into every detail, was the same woman who appeared in police reports and missing persons cases across the western United States. The contradiction felt impossible to reconcile, like trying to solve an equation where the numbers simply didn't add up to any logical conclusion. Michael found himself standing at the foot of the stairs, one hand on the banister, torn between the desperate need to confront Sarah and the equally desperate fear of what that confrontation might reveal. The woman he loved was sleeping peacefully in his childhood bedroom, probably dreaming of their wedding day, completely unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around her. In a few hours, she would put on her wedding dress and walk down the aisle toward a man who now knew secrets about her past that she'd never intended him to discover. The private investigator's final note had been both a warning and a prediction. Pattern suggests subject will attempt to disappear if confronted with evidence. Recommend immediate legal and financial protections. Michael looked up the stairs toward the bedroom where his fiancée slept, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he was looking at a complete stranger. The kitchen table was still covered with the evidence of Sarah's deception, and Michael carefully gathered the documents back into their manila envelope, handling them like they might explode at any moment. Tomorrow's wedding guests would arrive expecting to celebrate love conquering all, but Michael Peterson sat in his childhood kitchen as dawn broke over California, wondering if love had ever been part of the equation at all. The woman upstairs might have many names and many identities, But the question that tormented him most wasn't who she really was. It was whether anything they'd shared together had ever been real, or if he'd simply been the latest mark in a con game so sophisticated that even now, with all the evidence spread before him, part of his heart still wanted to believe that somehow, impossibly, her love for him might be the one true thing in a life built on lies. The soft creak of floorboards above made Michael's heart leap into his throat, and he quickly stuffed the documents back into their envelope as footsteps moved across the ceiling toward the bathroom. Sarah was awake, probably preparing for what she believed would be the most beautiful day of her life, unaware that her carefully constructed world was unraveling in the kitchen below. Michael listened to the familiar sounds of her morning routine, the gentle whoosh of water running, the soft thud of her setting down her contact lens case, the whispered humming of a song she'd been excited to walk down the aisle to in just a few hours. These intimate sounds that had once brought him comfort now felt like evidence of an elaborate performance, each note calculated to maintain the illusion of domestic bliss. The morning light streaming through the kitchen windows seemed harsh and unforgiving, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny accusations floating around him. He could smell coffee brewing automatically in the machine Sarah had programmed the night before, another thoughtful gesture that now felt like manipulation, designed to present the perfect picture of caring domesticity. "Good morning, baby. You're up early." Sarah's voice drifted down from the top of the stairs, sweet and sleepy and filled with the kind of genuine affection that made Michael's chest tighten with confusion. She appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing his old college t-shirt and a pair of shorts, her hair messy from sleep, but still somehow managing to look effortlessly beautiful in the way that had first caught his attention 3 years ago. Her smile was radiant, the expression of a woman who believed she was hours away from marrying the love of her life, and the innocence in her green eyes made Michael question everything he'd learned in the past few hours. This was the Sarah who had held him during thunderstorms because she knew he was afraid of lightning, who had learned to make his grandmother's famous chocolate chip cookies from scratch because she wanted to carry on family traditions. The contrast between this tender, caring woman and the calculating predator, described in the private investigators' reports, felt impossible to reconcile, like trying to believe that the same person could be both an angel and a demon. "Couldn't sleep," Michael managed to say, his voice sounding hollow and strange even to his own ears. Sarah padded across the kitchen in her bare feet, moving with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in this space that had become as much her home as his during their 3-year relationship. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her cheek against his back in a gesture so familiar and natural that for a moment Michael felt the temptation to pretend that the documents hidden in the envelope were just a terrible nightmare. Her skin was warm against his shirt, and she smelled like the lavender lotion she always used before bed, scents and sensations that had once meant safety and love, but now felt like weapons being used against his rational mind. The envelope seemed to burn where it sat on the counter behind him, its contents threatening to destroy the peaceful morning scene that felt both completely real and utterly false at the same time. "Wedding day jitters?" Sarah asked softly, her voice muffled against his shirt. She moved around to face him, reaching up to smooth the worry lines from his forehead with gentle fingers that had traced every inch of his face 1,000 times before. The concern in her expression seemed genuine, but Michael found himself analyzing every micro-expression, searching for signs of the deception that the evidence suggested should be there. Was the slight tightness around her eyes a sign of nervousness about maintaining her cover, or was it simply the normal anxiety of a bride on her wedding day? When she bit her lower lip in the way that had always driven him crazy with desire, was it a calculated move to disarm him, or just a nervous habit he'd fallen in love with years ago? The paranoia felt toxic, poisoning every interaction with doubt and suspicion, but Michael couldn't seem to turn off the analytical part of his mind that was now treating their relationship like a crime scene to be investigated. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 a.m., and Sarah's face lit up with excitement as she practically bounced toward the front door. "That must be my mom and Aunt Linda. They're here to help me get ready." Her enthusiasm felt infectious despite everything Michael now knew, and he watched her hurry to answer the door with the same mix of nervousness and joy that every bride should feel on her wedding morning. Linda Coleman, Sarah's aunt, swept into the house like a force of nature, her arms full of garment bags and makeup cases, followed by a woman Michael had met several times as Sarah's mother, Helen. But now, staring at Helen Coleman's face in the harsh morning light, Michael noticed details that he'd somehow missed before. The way her eyes never quite met his for more than a second, the nervous tick of constantly adjusting her purse strap, the careful way she spoke as if every word was being measured for potential consequences. The private investigator's report had mentioned that Sarah's family members might also be part of whatever scheme was being run, and suddenly, Michael felt like he was seeing his future in-laws with completely new eyes. "Michael, sweetheart, you look terrible," Helen exclaimed, reaching up to cup his face with hands that felt cold despite the warm morning. "Did you sleep at all? You know it's bad luck for the groom to see the bride on the wedding day before the ceremony." Her laugh sounded forced, and there was something in her expression that made Michael wonder if she knew about the investigation, if this entire family was part of an elaborate con designed to separate him from his money and possibly his life. The thought seemed paranoid even to his own racing mind, but the evidence was overwhelming. Too many coincidences, too many inconsistencies, too many things that didn't add up when viewed through the lens of what he now knew about Sarah's past. Helen's designer handbag probably cost more than most people made in a month, and her jewelry looked expensive in a way that didn't match the struggling artist narrative Sarah had always shared about her family's financial situation. Aunt Linda began setting up what looked like a mobile beauty salon in the living room, chattering excitedly about the day's timeline and the weather forecast, and how beautiful Sarah was going to look walking down the aisle. But Michael found himself focusing on the way Linda kept checking her phone, the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from both women, and the careful way they avoided any questions about family history or childhood memories that might reveal inconsistencies in whatever story they'd constructed. Sarah disappeared upstairs to shower, calling down instructions about breakfast and reminders about the photographer's arrival time, her voice filled with the kind of genuine happiness that made Michael's heart break all over again. Either she was the most skilled actress he'd ever encountered, or there was something about this situation that he wasn't understanding correctly, some explanation that could reconcile the loving woman he knew with the predator described in the investigator's files. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking like she hadn't slept any better than Michael, her usually perfect hair showing signs of a restless night, and her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and worry. She took one look at Helen and Linda, setting up their preparations, and her expression hardened in a way that Michael had rarely seen from his generally diplomatic mother. The tension in the room became palpable, like the moments before a thunderstorm, when the air itself feels charged with electricity, and Michael realized that whatever confrontation was coming would involve more than just him and Sarah. Margaret had always been protective of her children, but there was something different in her posture now, something that reminded Michael of a mother bear protecting her cubs from a perceived threat. The investigator's report had given her ammunition, but it had also given her a mission, and Margaret Peterson had never backed down from a fight when her family was at stake. "Helen, Linda, how lovely to see you both," Margaret said with the kind of false sweetness that Michael recognized as his mother's version of a declaration of war. "I was hoping we could have a little chat before the day gets too hectic. Maybe in private?" The suggestion sounded innocent enough, but the undercurrent of steel in Margaret's voice made it clear that this wasn't really a request. Helen's face went pale, and Linda dropped the makeup brush she'd been holding, both women suddenly looking like deer caught in headlights. Michael watched this exchange with growing fascination, realizing that his mother had a plan, that the private investigator's report hadn't just been about gathering information but about preparing for some kind of strategic confrontation. For the first time since learning about Sarah's deception, Michael felt a spark of something that might have been hope, or at least the possibility that he wasn't completely powerless in whatever game was being played around him. The sound of Sarah singing in the shower drifted down from upstairs, her voice clear and happy, as she performed what she probably thought was her final performance as a single woman. Michael found himself listening to the words of the song she'd chosen, something about new beginnings and everlasting love, and wondering if the lyrics held some kind of clue about her true intentions. Was this elaborate wedding just the final step in whatever scheme she'd been running, the moment when she would gain legal access to his assets and whatever else she was really after? Or was there some possibility, however remote, that her feelings for him were genuine even if everything else about her identity was a lie? The questions multiplied faster than he could process them, creating a feedback loop of doubt and paranoia that threatened to drive him to the edge of sanity before the day had even truly begun. Margaret gestured for Helen and Linda to follow her into the den, and Michael watched his future mother-in-law's face crumble into an expression of pure terror as she realized that her carefully maintained cover might be about to be blown. Linda grabbed Helen's arm as if to steady her, but her own hands were shaking so badly that she provided no support at all. The three women disappeared behind the closed door of the den, and Michael could hear the low murmur of voices, but couldn't make out specific words. Whatever Margaret was saying, it was having an immediate effect, because within minutes he could hear what sounded like crying and desperate whispers. The sound made his stomach clench with a mixture of vindication and dread. Vindication because it meant his mother's suspicions were correct, and dread because it meant that everything he'd feared about Sarah was probably true as well. "Baby, where did everyone go?" Sarah's voice called from the top of the stairs, and Michael looked up to see her wrapped in a fluffy white bathrobe, her wet hair creating dark patches on the terry cloth. She looked young and vulnerable, and absolutely beautiful, like a bride in a romantic comedy who had no idea that her perfect life was about to be turned upside down by forces beyond her control. But now Michael could see the calculation behind her innocent expression, the way her eyes quickly scanned the room, taking inventory of who was where and what might be happening outside her direct control. When she realized that her mother and aunt were missing from the living room where she'd left them, a flicker of something that might have been panic crossed her features before she quickly recovered her composure. The mask slipped for just a moment, but it was long enough for Michael to see the predator lurking beneath the beautiful surface, and that glimpse hit him like a physical blow to the chest. "They're talking with my mum," Michael said carefully, watching Sarah's reaction with the kind of attention he usually reserved for debugging complex code. Her smile faltered for just a split second before returning full force, but that momentary hesitation told him everything he needed to know about how aware she was of the precarious nature of whatever game she'd been playing. Sarah had built her entire relationship with him on a foundation of lies, but she was smart enough to know that all deceptions eventually came to light, especially when they involved families and legal commitments like marriage. The fact that she'd been willing to go through with a wedding, despite knowing that it would create a paper trail and legal connections, suggested either incredible confidence in her ability to maintain her cover or desperation born of circumstances that Michael didn't yet understand. Either way, he was no longer the naive victim he'd been just hours before. He was a man with information, allies, and the beginning of a plan to take control of his own story before it was too late. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times, marking another hour closer to a wedding that was beginning to feel more like a battlefield than a celebration, and Michael Peterson stood in his childhood kitchen watching the woman he'd planned to marry, finally beginning to see her clearly for the first time in 3 years. The den door opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot, and Helen Coleman emerged looking like she'd aged a decade in the span of 20 minutes, her carefully applied makeup streaked with tears and her designer clothes somehow looking shabby and desperate in the harsh morning light. Linda followed close behind, clutching a tissue and avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room, her nervous energy now transformed into something that looked suspiciously like defeat. Margaret appeared last, her expression calm and controlled, but with a steely determination in her eyes that reminded Michael of his father during his military days, the look of someone who had just won a crucial battle and was preparing for the war that would follow. The silence that filled the house felt thick and oppressive, broken only by the sound of Sarah's footsteps as she hurried down the stairs, still wrapped in her white bathrobe, but moving with the quick, predatory grace of someone who sensed that her carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse around her. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to spotlight the 4 people standing in the living room like actors on a stage, each waiting for someone else to deliver the lines that would determine how this drama would end. "What's going on down here?" Sarah asked, her voice bright and cheerful but with an underlying note of tension that hadn't been there before. Her green eyes moved quickly from face to face, reading the emotional landscape with the skill of someone who had spent years learning to identify threats and opportunities in the expressions of others. When her gaze landed on her mother's tear-streaked face, something shifted in Sarah's posture, a subtle straightening that reminded Michael of a cat preparing to either fight or flee. The transformation was almost imperceptible, but once he'd noticed it, Michael couldn't unsee the predator that lurked beneath the bride's innocent exterior. This wasn't the woman who had cried happy tears at Christmas morning or fallen asleep in his arms during thunderstorms. This was someone calculating angles and exit strategies while maintaining the perfect mask of confused concern. The private investigator had been right about one thing. When cornered, Sarah's true nature began to show through the cracks in her carefully maintained facade. Margaret stepped forward, holding the manila envelope like it contained evidence in a capital murder case, which in some ways it did, evidence of the murder of trust, of love, of the future Michael had believed he was building with the woman he thought he knew. "Sarah, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about who you really are and what you really want from my son." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Michael watched Sarah's face cycle through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, fear, and finally a kind of cold resignation that was more terrifying than any anger could have been. Helen let out a small whimper and sank into the nearest chair, while Linda looked like she wanted to disappear into the wallpaper entirely. But Sarah straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin with the defiance of someone who had been caught but wasn't ready to surrender. And for the first time since he'd known her, Michael saw the steel spine that had allowed her to run cons across multiple states for what appeared to be years. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, Margaret, but I love your son and I'm going to marry him today, regardless of whatever paranoid delusions you've concocted." Sarah's voice had changed, losing the soft, slightly breathless quality that Michael had always found so endearing, and taking on the hard edge of someone who had been backed into a corner and was prepared to fight her way out. The transformation was so complete that it felt like watching a special effect in a horror movie. The beautiful woman he'd fallen in love with was still there physically, but everything about her essence had shifted into something cold and dangerous. Margaret smiled at Sarah's response, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who had been expecting exactly this reaction and had prepared accordingly. The envelope rustled as Margaret opened it, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense atmosphere of the living room where Michael had opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays for most of his life. "Sarah Coleman, Sarah Mitchell, Michelle Banks, Sarah Williams, which name would you prefer I use?" Margaret's voice was calm and conversational, as if she were discussing the weather rather than systematically dismantling the identity of her son's fiancée. The effect of those names on Sarah was immediate and dramatic. Her face went pale, then flushed, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides before she forced them to relax. Michael had never seen her lose control like this, had never witnessed the moment when someone's carefully constructed persona cracked under pressure, and the sight was both fascinating and heartbreaking. This was the woman he'd planned to promise "until death do us part" to in just a few hours, and he was only now seeing who she really was beneath the layers of deception and manipulation. Linda made a sound like a wounded animal and bolted for the front door, but Margaret's next words stopped her in her tracks. "The police are already on their way, Linda. I called them an hour ago." The confession came in pieces, like a dam breaking gradually rather than all at once, and Michael found himself sitting on the couch where he'd watched Saturday morning cartoons as a child, listening to the woman he loved describe a life that sounded like something out of a crime novel. Sarah's real name was Michelle Sarah Banks, and she was 29, not 26, as she'd claimed throughout their relationship. She'd been running variations of the same con for almost a decade, targeting lonely, successful men who were at vulnerable points in their lives, recently divorced, dealing with family deaths, or simply isolated by careers that left little time for genuine relationships. The formula was simple and devastatingly effective: become everything they needed her to be, gain access to their finances and personal information, and disappear before anyone realized what had happened. Helen wasn't her mother, but her partner in the con, an older woman who specialized in playing maternal figures and providing the kind of family background that made Marks feel comfortable and trusting. "But you were different, Michael," Sarah said, and for a moment her voice carried the same genuine emotion that had convinced him to fall in love with her in the first place. "I wasn't supposed to stay this long. I wasn't supposed to actually—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence, but Michael could see something in her expression that might have been real regret, or at least the closest thing to genuine emotion that someone like her was capable of feeling. The admission hit him like a physical blow. He had been different, but not in the way he'd hoped. He hadn't been special enough to inspire her to change her life. He'd simply been easy enough to manipulate that she'd gotten comfortable and stayed longer than was safe. The realization that their entire relationship had been an extended version of her usual con, rather than something that had evolved into genuine feeling, felt like watching someone take a sledgehammer to the foundation of his entire adult life. Margaret continued reading from the investigator's report, with the methodical precision of a prosecutor laying out evidence for a jury, and each revelation painted a picture of a woman who had left a trail of broken men and ruined lives across the western United States. James Chen in Portland had attempted suicide after losing his life savings and his grandmother's jewelry collection. Robert Martinez in Denver had died in what appeared to be a suspicious accident just weeks after changing his will to include Sarah as a beneficiary. Thomas Anderson in Phoenix had lost everything to cryptocurrency investments that Sarah had enthusiastically recommended, investments that had somehow benefited shell companies connected to her network of accomplices. The pattern was clear and devastating. Sarah specialized in finding men who were financially stable but emotionally vulnerable, and she used their loneliness and desire for connection as weapons against them until she'd extracted everything of value from their lives. "The wedding accounts," Michael said quietly, the pieces finally clicking into place with sickening clarity. "You've had access to all our wedding accounts for months." Sarah's expression confirmed what he already knew. Their shared planning for the future had given her exactly what she needed to access not just the money they'd saved for the ceremony, but information about his broader financial situation, his family's assets and his business connections. The joint bank account they'd opened, the insurance policies they'd discussed, the power of attorney documents she'd suggested they sign as part of their pre-marriage planning, all of it had been designed to give her legal access to his life in ways that would allow her to disappear with maximum profit when the time was right. The wedding itself was probably meant to be her exit strategy, a final performance that would cement her legal rights before she vanished with everything she could carry. The sound of sirens in the distance made Sarah's head snap toward the window, and Michael could see the exact moment when she realized that her carefully planned escape route had been cut off by forces she hadn't anticipated. Margaret had been 3 steps ahead from the moment she'd decided to hire the private investigator, and now Sarah was trapped in a situation where her usual tactics, charm, manipulation, and strategic disappearance were no longer viable options. The police cars pulled into the driveway with their lights flashing but no sirens, and Michael watched through the living room window as uniformed officers approached the house where he'd grown up believing in happy endings and the fundamental goodness of people. The irony wasn't lost on him that what should have been the morning of his wedding was instead becoming the morning when he learned that love could be weaponized by people who had no capacity for genuine human connection. "I need you to know that some of it was real," Sarah said suddenly, turning to face Michael with an expression that might have been desperate honesty or simply another manipulation designed to minimize the consequences of her exposure. "Not the name, not the background, not most of the stories I told you, but the way I felt when you held me during storms, the way you made me laugh, the way you looked at me like I was something precious instead of something to be used, that was real. I'd never experienced anything like that before." The confession should have provided some comfort, some evidence that their relationship had contained moments of genuine connection, despite being built on a foundation of lies. But instead, it made Michael feel hollow and used in ways that seemed even worse than simple deception. To know that Sarah was capable of real feeling, but had chosen to use those feelings as tools in her manipulation, felt like the ultimate betrayal of everything he believed about human nature and the possibility of authentic love. Margaret handed the police officers copies of the private investigator's report, while Sarah stood in the center of the living room, like a queen facing execution, her white bathrobe now looking less like bridal innocence and more like a costume she'd grown tired of wearing. Helen had collapsed completely, sobbing into her hands and babbling confessions about bank accounts in the Cayman Islands and storage units full of stolen property. But Sarah maintained her composure with the grace of someone who had always known this day would eventually come. The officers were professional and courteous, explaining her rights and the charges that were being filed in multiple jurisdictions, but Michael barely heard the words over the sound of his own heart breaking in real time. This was the woman who had planned to walk down the aisle to him in just a few hours, who had spent months choosing flowers and selecting a menu and writing vows that she probably never intended to keep. The beautiful wedding dress hanging upstairs would never be worn. The cake would never be cut, and the 230 guests would arrive to find that the celebration they'd expected had been replaced by a crime scene. "Michael," Sarah said as the officers prepared to escort her to their patrol car, and her use of his name without any endearment felt like the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. "I'm sorry. For what it's worth, you deserved better than what I was capable of giving you." The apology felt both genuine and completely inadequate, an acknowledgement of damage that could never be undone, and trust that could never be rebuilt. Michael watched the woman he'd planned to spend his life with being led away in handcuffs, her white bathrobe a stark contrast to the cold metal restraints, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The boy who had believed in fairy tales and happy endings was dying, but in his place a man was being born who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love was having the strength to walk away from someone who could never love you back in the way you deserved. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another hour closer to a wedding that would never happen, and Michael Peterson stood in his childhood living room, finally free from the elaborate prison that someone else's lies had built around his heart. The silence that filled the house after the police cars disappeared down the street felt different from the oppressive tension that had dominated the morning. This was the quiet of a storm that had finally passed, leaving behind wreckage that could be examined and eventually cleared away. Michael stood at the living room window watching the last patrol car turn the corner, and for the first time in hours, he felt like he could breathe fully again. The wedding dress still hung upstairs like a ghost of the future that would never come to pass, and in a few hours, guests would begin arriving for a celebration that had transformed overnight into something closer to a funeral for the death of illusion. But standing there in the growing morning light, Michael felt something unexpected stirring in his chest, not relief exactly, but a kind of grim satisfaction that came from knowing he'd escaped a trap that could have destroyed not just his financial security, but his fundamental ability to trust and love again. Margaret appeared beside him at the window, her silver hair catching the sunlight as she reached out to squeeze his shoulder, with the same gentle strength that had guided him through every crisis of his childhood and young adulthood. "How did you know?" Michael asked quietly, finally ready to hear the story of how his mother had saved him from what might have been the worst mistake of his life. Margaret's smile was sad but proud, the expression of someone who had taken no pleasure in being right about something so devastating, but who was grateful that her instincts had been strong enough to prevent an even greater tragedy. She explained that it had started with small inconsistencies, stories that didn't quite match from one telling to the next, gaps in Sarah's history that never seemed to get filled in despite 3 years of relationship, and most tellingly, the way Sarah always seemed to have just enough financial trouble to need help, but never quite enough to be truly desperate. The private investigator had been expensive, Margaret admitted, but watching Sarah's reaction to unexpected questions about her childhood had convinced her that professional help was necessary to uncover whatever truth was being hidden beneath the surface of such carefully maintained perfection. The phone had been ringing steadily since 8 a.m., and Michael finally answered to begin the heartbreaking process of cancelling a wedding that had been 18 months in the planning. His cousin Tommy, who was supposed to serve as his best man, listened in stunned silence as Michael explained that there would be no ceremony, no reception, no celebration of love conquering all. The caterers were surprisingly understanding, having apparently dealt with wedding cancellations before, though none quite as dramatic as this one. The florist was less accommodating, but Margaret quietly took over those conversations, her voice calm and professional as she negotiated the logistics of undoing a day that was supposed to have been perfect. Michael found himself oddly detached from these practical concerns, as if he were watching someone else dismantle the elaborate fantasy that had consumed so much of his emotional energy for the past year and a half. Each phone call felt like another layer of illusion being stripped away, revealing the stark reality of how much time and money he'd invested in loving someone who had never actually existed. The hardest call was to his father's best friend, Father Martinez, who had agreed to perform the ceremony and had known Michael since he was a baby, learning to walk in the church pews during Sunday morning services. The elderly priest listened without judgment, as Michael explained what had been discovered about Sarah's true identity, and his response carried the weight of decades spent counseling parishioners through betrayals and heartbreaks that tested their faith in both divine providence and human nature. Sometimes, Michael, God protects us from tragedies we don't even know we're walking toward. Your mother's instincts may have saved you from something much worse than a cancelled wedding. The words provided a comfort that Michael hadn't expected to find in this wreckage, a sense that perhaps the universe had been looking out for him, even when he'd been too blinded by love to look out for himself. Father Martinez offered to come over and help with the notification process, but Michael declined, knowing that this was something he needed to handle himself as part of accepting responsibility for how thoroughly he'd been deceived. By noon, word had spread through their extended family and friend networks with the efficiency of wildfire, and Michael's phone was buzzing constantly with messages of support, shock, and offers to help however possible. His college roommate Jake drove down from San Francisco without being asked, arriving with pizza and beer and the kind of steadfast friendship that reminded Michael that not all relationships were built on deception and manipulation. Margaret had called Michael's siblings, and by evening, the house was full of people who loved him unconditionally, creating a buffer of genuine affection that helped cushion the impact of discovering that the woman he'd planned to spend his life with had never actually loved him at all. The conversation was stilted at first, everyone unsure how to navigate the emotional minefield of a wedding day that had become something else entirely. But gradually the shock gave way to storytelling, shared memories, and the kind of dark humor that families use to process traumatic events that are too big to understand all at once. The local news picked up the story by the weekend, describing it as a romance scam that nearly ended in marriage, and interviewing experts about the psychology of long-term emotional manipulation. Michael declined all interview requests, but he did agree to speak with the detective handling Sarah's case, providing details about their financial arrangements and timeline that might help build cases against her for the crimes she'd committed in other states. Learning that his information might help bring justice for the other men Sarah had victimized, especially James Chen, who was slowly recovering from his suicide attempt, gave Michael a sense of purpose that helped transform his anger into something more productive than self-pity. The detective, a middle-aged woman named Rebecca Torres who specialized in fraud cases, explained that Sarah's network had been under investigation for months, but they'd never been able to build solid cases because her victims were often too embarrassed to come forward with complete information about how thoroughly they'd been manipulated. 2 weeks after the wedding that never happened, Michael drove to the beach where he'd proposed to Sarah, carrying the engagement ring she'd left behind when the police took her away. The sunset was spectacular, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded him of the romantic ideal he'd been chasing when he'd gotten down on one knee in this same spot 18 months earlier. But instead of the crushing sadness he'd expected to feel, Michael found himself experiencing something closer to gratitude for the narrow escape he'd experienced thanks to his mother's protective instincts and his own decision to listen to uncomfortable truths rather than clinging to beautiful lies. He threw the ring into the ocean with all the force he could muster, watching it disappear beneath the waves like a piece of his old life that he was finally ready to leave behind. The gesture felt both ceremonial and practical, a way of formally ending his engagement to someone who had never truly existed, while also ensuring that the symbol of their false love would never resurface to tempt him back into the fantasy of what might have been. The therapy sessions started a month later, not because Michael felt broken beyond repair, but because he was determined to understand how someone as intelligent and generally perceptive as himself had been so thoroughly deceived for such an extended period of time. Dr. Patricia Hendricks specialized in helping victims of emotional manipulation rebuild their ability to trust their own judgment, and her office became a safe space where Michael could examine the relationship without the pressure of having to defend Sarah or minimize the extent of his victimization. The process was sometimes painful, particularly when he realized how many red flags he'd ignored or rationalized away, because he'd wanted so desperately to believe in the love story he thought he was living. But it was also empowering to understand the sophisticated psychological techniques that Sarah had used, recognizing that falling for her manipulation was evidence of his capacity for trust and love, rather than proof of some fundamental flaw in his character or judgment. 6 months after the wedding that never was, Michael received a letter from the district attorney's office informing him that Sarah had accepted a plea bargain that would send her to prison for 8 years and require her to pay restitution to her victims in an amount that would probably take decades to complete. The letter included an address where he could send a victim impact statement if he chose to do so, but Michael found that he had surprisingly little interest in trying to articulate the emotional damage of discovering that someone he'd loved completely had never actually existed at all. Sarah would face the legal consequences of her choices, but the real healing had come from understanding that her deception said everything about her character and nothing about his worth as a person deserving of genuine love and honest partnership. The boy who had believed that love was enough to overcome any obstacle had died on that terrible morning in his mother's kitchen, but the man who had taken his place understood that real love could only exist between people who were brave enough to show up as their authentic selves, flaws and all. A year later, Michael met Rebecca at a coffee shop not far from his office, and their conversation about books led to dinner, which led to the kind of slow, careful courtship between two people who had both learned that the best relationships are built on a foundation of genuine compatibility rather than overwhelming passion or perfect compatibility with impossible ideals. Rebecca was a librarian with a gentle sense of humor, a love of hiking, and the kind of quiet strength that came from having survived her own share of heartbreak and disappointment without becoming cynical about the possibility of finding real partnership. She knew about Sarah from the beginning. Michael had learned that honesty was non-negotiable in any relationship worth having, and her response had been compassion rather than judgment, understanding rather than the kind of dramatic sympathy that would have made him feel like a victim rather than a survivor. Their love grew slowly and organically, built on shared values and genuine affection, rather than the intense, overwhelming passion that he now recognized as one of the warning signs of manipulation rather than evidence of true compatibility. 2 years after the morning that changed everything, Michael and Rebecca were married in a small ceremony in his parents' backyard, with Father Martinez officiating and Margaret Peterson beaming with the kind of pride that comes from watching her son choose wisely after learning difficult lessons about the difference between love and manipulation. The guest list included 30 people who genuinely cared about both bride and groom, and the celebration felt joyful and authentic in ways that the elaborate production he'd planned with Sarah never could have achieved. Rebecca wore her grandmother's simple dress and carried wildflowers from Margaret's garden, and Michael's vows were written from the heart rather than copied from wedding websites, reflecting his gratitude for finding someone who loved him exactly as he was, rather than as a character in whatever fantasy she was trying to create. The wedding photos captured moments of genuine happiness and connection, and when Michael looked at them years later, he could see the peace that came from building a life with someone who showed up as herself and allowed him to do the same. Standing at his own kitchen window on a quiet Sunday morning 5 years later, watching Rebecca play in the backyard with their 2-year-old daughter Emma, Michael sometimes thought about the path that had led him to this moment of simple, authentic happiness. Sarah's deception had been devastating at the time, but it had also been the catalyst that forced him to examine his own patterns and expectations about love, partnership, and the kind of person he wanted to become. The experience had taught him that the most dangerous lies are often the ones we tell ourselves about red flags we're choosing to ignore, and that the greatest act of self-love is developing the courage to walk away from relationships that require us to diminish ourselves to maintain them. Emma's laughter floated through the open window like music, and Michael smiled as Rebecca looked up and waved at him with soil-stained fingers from the garden where she was teaching their daughter to plant tomatoes and sunflowers and all the beautiful things that grew from seeds planted in honest earth. The story of Sarah and the wedding that never happened had become part of Michael's personal mythology, but it was no longer a source of shame or regret. Instead, it was evidence of his capacity to survive betrayal and learn from it, to rebuild his life on a stronger foundation, and to recognize that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the worst disasters. He kept in touch with James Chen, the man from Portland who had also been one of Sarah's victims, and their friendship had become proof that healing was possible even from the deepest betrayals when people were willing to support each other through the process of learning to trust again. Michael had learned that love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone honest enough to grow alongside, brave enough to show their flaws, and committed enough to do the work of building something real together, rather than maintaining the exhausting performance of someone else's impossible expectations. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 times, marking another beautiful morning in a life built on truth, rather than illusion, and Michael Peterson stood in his kitchen counting his blessings and remembering that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is discovering the truth about someone before it's too late to save yourself. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear that surviving betrayal doesn't close the door to real love. It opens the door to something even better, built on the unshakable foundation of truth, respect, and the courage to love someone exactly as they are rather than who you need them to be.